You've heard the name before, Muhammad. For many, he's simply a religious figure in history, an Arab man who founded Islam and claimed to hear the voice of God. But what if we've only scratched the surface? What if Muhammad's story is not just about the rise of a new religion, but the reawakening of a spiritual lineage the world chose to forget long before the Quran, before Mecca echoed with a call to prayer, before the angel Gabriel appeared in a cave? There was another desert, another son, Ishmael, cast out but not cursed, sent away but not abandoned. Scripture tells us that God heard the boy's cry and promised he would become a great nation. And then, silence. No prophet, no law, no written covenant, just generations of wandering. Until one day in a hidden cave outside of Mecca, a voice spoke again. This is not just a story of prophecy. It is a mystery buried beneath centuries of doctrine, a question that shakes the foundation of religious certainty. Could Muhammad be more than just a man who started a new faith? Could his voice, controversial, contested, and often misunderstood, be the echo of a divine promise spoken thousands of years before? This journey will challenge assumptions, uncover forgotten truths, and walk the line between reverence and revelation. We will explore the life of Muhammad like never before, not just as the founder of Islam, but as a figure whose story may connect more deeply to the sacred narrative of Scripture than anyone ever told you. Stay with me until the end, because what begins as history may end as a revelation, a prophet in the shadows of history. Long before the birth of Muhammad, long before the sands of Mecca whispered his name, there was another story unfolding, one that began not in Arabia, but in the tents of Abraham. Genesis tells us of a child named Ishmael, born of Hagar, an Egyptian maidservant. Cast out into the wilderness by Sarah's jealousy, Ishmael was not forgotten by heaven. The angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar and spoke a promise that echoes across the centuries that her son would become a great nation. And yet, after Genesis, Ishmael's line seems to vanish into the margins of the sacred text, overshadowed by Isaac's covenant and Jacob's descendants. The scriptures grow quiet, but history does not. Arab tradition preserved through oral genealogies and later Islamic records holds that Ishmael settled in the desert of Arabia and became the forefather of many tribes, including the Quraysh, the noble lineage from which Muhammad would eventually emerge. Among these tribes, one name rises with quiet significance: Adnan, often believed to be a direct descendant of Ishmael. It is from this line passed down through generations of desert dwellers that Muhammad is said to have been born. Though the Bible does not follow Ishmael's lineage with the same detail it gives to Isaac's, the Islamic tradition treats his line not as a rival, but as a continuation, a parallel path of divine purpose. And so in the barren spaces between scripture and history, a prophetic tension begins to form. What if the voice that once cried out from the wilderness of Paran found its fulfillment not in the line of kings and priests we know, but in the life of a man the world was not prepared to understand? What if the silence that followed Ishmael was not abandonment, but preparation? For from this hidden lineage shaped by exile and perseverance, a child would be born in Mecca alone, unnoticed, and seemingly insignificant. And yet, even before his first words were recorded, the heavens had already written his name into the desert wind. Born into orphanhood, the silent preparation. Muhammad's birth did not stir the earth. There were no stars in the sky, no choirs of angels proclaiming his arrival. He entered the world in silence, orphaned, before he took his first breath. His father Abdullah had died months before his birth. His mother Amina would die before he turned 7. Left without parents in a tribal world where lineage was everything, Muhammad should have been forgotten. But he was not. He was taken in by his grandfather Abd al-Muttalib and later by his uncle Abu Talib, a man of modest means but great honor. These guardians could not offer him power or wealth, but they gave him something rarer, a life shaped by hardship, humility, and quiet strength. As a child, Muhammad was not marked by visions or miracles. He watched. He listened. He learned to survive not by domination, but by dignity. His people called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy, not because he fought battles or recited scripture, but because his integrity shone in the small things, in trade, in speech, in the way he carried himself among merchants and neighbors. There was a stillness about him, a silence that carried weight. And in that silence, something ancient was being forged. It is in these forgotten years, those unseen decades of obscurity and loss, that we glimpse the divine pattern. The greatest callings often rise from the deepest hiddenness. Prophets are not born on thrones. They are shaped in caves and exile, in the spaces where no one is watching. And in Muhammad's case, the cave was not just symbolic, it was real. A place where silence would soon give way to thunder. A mountain where mystery would descend. A voice that would change everything. The cave and the voice echoes of Sinai. Mount Hira rose above the rocky plains like a sentinel watching over Mecca's restless streets. At its heart was a small shadowed cave, bare, cold, and utterly silent. It was here that Muhammad came to seek solitude, not out of madness or ritual, but from a restless ache within. He had begun to see the injustice in his city, the poor exploited idols traded like charms, truth drowned in wealth and pride. Something in him recoiled, and so he climbed, again and again, night after night, into the silence, into the question. It was in that cave around the year 610 that the silence shattered, not with a whisper, but with a command. According to Islamic tradition, the angel Gabriel appeared before him in blazing presence and thundered the word, "Iqra," recite. Muhammad trembled. He could not read. He had never spoken prophecy. But the word came again and again, until something opened in him, and the first verses of the Quran poured out like fire across parchment. It is impossible to overstate the magnitude of that moment. This was not merely personal, it was cosmic. The heavens had broken into history. The voice of God, silent for centuries since the last of the Hebrew prophets, was speaking again. But this time in Arabic, to a man with no scriptures, in a land with no temple. The encounter mirrors Sinai in many ways, a mountain, a voice, a commission. But unlike Moses, Muhammad had no staff, no signs, no support, only revelation, only obedience, and yet not all believed it was divine. Some in his own tribe whispered that it was not an angel, but a jinn, a desert spirit, a deceiver. The line between prophecy and possession is thin when heaven speaks through the unexpected. And for years, this question would haunt the edges of his ministry. But whether angel or apparition, one thing was certain: the silence had ended. A new chapter had begun. And the voice that had once spoken to prophets in Hebrew was now echoing across the desert in Arabic, calling a forgotten people to remember. Beneath that call lay a single word: Islam. Not a name, but an invitation. Not a command, but a surrender. Islam, surrender, or reclamation. The word Islam does not mean conquest. It does not mean rule, it means surrender, complete submission to the will of God. But surrender in a world of idols and ambition is a radical thing. To the Meccans, it was heresy. To the oppressed, it was hope. To the prophets, it was always the path. In the Quran, Abraham is described not merely as a patriarch, but as a Muslim one who submitted to God before the term even existed. And in this framing, Islam is not a new religion, but the renewal of a forgotten covenant, a return to the pure monotheism of Abraham before law and temple, before nation and priesthood. Muhammad did not claim to bring something novel. He claimed to restore what had been lost, to call a wandering people back to the path walked by Noah, Moses, and Jesus. And yet the world did not see it as restoration. It saw it as revolt. For centuries, the religious narrative of salvation had followed a singular line from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. But now from the wilderness side of that story, a new voice cried out, not to replace but to recall, not to erase but to complete. And in that act of surrender, something powerful began to stir, not just in Mecca, but across the peninsula. Tribes began to listen, slaves began to believe, and the very people who once cast out the child of the bondwoman were now being called into a covenant of their own. But surrender, though spiritual, has consequences, especially when it threatens those who profit from disobedience. And as Muhammad's following grew, so did the storm. The next movement would not come in a cave, but in a journey, a migration marked not by retreat, but by rebirth. The flight to Medina, a nation in the making. Persecution had reached its breaking point. 13 years of ridicule, violence, and exile had taken its toll on Muhammad's growing but fragile community. The leaders of Mecca had tried everything: bribes, threats, plots against his life. And so, in the year 622, under the cover of night, Muhammad left his birthplace behind. He traveled north to Yathrib, a city of warring tribes in desperate need of peace. It would become known as Medina, the city of the prophet, and it was there that Islam shifted from a movement to a nation. Through the Constitution of Medina, Muhammad did something revolutionary. He established a multi-faith agreement between Muslims, Jews, and pagan tribes, a covenant of mutual defense and shared responsibility. This was not just a religious proclamation. It was political, social, and deeply prophetic. What emerged was more than safety. It was identity. In Medina, the Muslims were no longer a persecuted group. They were a people, a community, a new kind of nation founded not on bloodlines, but on belief. Their calendar would begin here not with conquest or coronation, but with a flight, a Hijrah, a sacred leaving. But even as they built anew, Mecca was not forgotten. The city that once cast them out still held the Kaaba, the ancient house of Abraham, surrounded by idols. And in time, the prophet would return not as a fugitive, but as a messenger bearing fire and mercy. And that return would not merely reclaim a city, it would awaken a lineage long buried under centuries of silence, the Ishmaelite. Awakening prophecy or rivalry. For millennia, the world's attention had been fixed on the sons of Isaac, on the law of Moses, the kingdom of David, the gospel of Christ. But what of the sons of Ishmael? What of the child born of exile, promised greatness, but hidden from the sacred record? In Muhammad, many Muslims see the fulfillment of that ancient promise, a prophet from the desert, born of Ishmael's seed, called to proclaim the unity of God. To them, this is not rivalry, it is reclamation. The rise of Islam is not a rebellion against Scripture, but its continuation through a forgotten branch. Yet to others, especially within Christian and Jewish traditions, Muhammad's claim is contested. They see divergence where others see alignment. They point to theological differences, prophetic distinctions, the absence of clear biblical endorsement. And they ask, could the line of Ishmael truly carry divine revelation? This tension is not new. It is as old as the tents of Abraham, as sharp as the blade that nearly fell on Isaac's neck. But now it speaks in a different tongue. It calls from minarets instead of synagogues. It writes in Arabic instead of Hebrew. And yet beneath the differences there remains a question that will not be silenced. Can God speak from both mountains, from Sinai and Hijrah? Can truth rise from the wilderness once more? For the voice that once wept in the desert of Paran now echoes in a billion hearts. And whether it is heard as prophecy or pretense, its sound cannot be undone. And perhaps that is the mystery, that what was cast out was not forgotten, that the promise to Hagar still lives, that the voice of a child in the wilderness would one day become the voice of a prophet to nations. And in the stillness after the storm, we are left not with certainty, but with a silence that invites us to listen again. The story of Muhammad is not just the account of a man, it is the echo of a question that began in the wilderness. A child once cast out, crying beneath a desert sky. A promise spoken by God, yet seemingly swallowed by silence. And then centuries later, a voice rising again from that same wilderness, not in defiance, but in remembrance. What if the divine story is wider than we imagine? What if God's promises do not only flow through the obvious line, but also through the forgotten one? What if the sons of Ishmael were not left behind, but were waiting carrying something sacred until the appointed time? The rise of Islam and the life of Muhammad confront us with a paradox that Scripture never fully resolves. A tension between lineage and calling, between inheritance and revelation. It forces us to consider, can truth emerge from a place we did not expect? Can prophecy come from the margins? Whether one views Muhammad as prophet, reformer, or historical figure, his story cannot be ignored. It demands our attention not merely for what it says about Islam, but for what it reveals about the nature of God, the God who hears the outcast, who sees the wilderness, who fulfills promises even when we forget them. If this exploration stirred something in you, a question, a realization, a new layer of curiosity, I invite you to join the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you already know? What surprised you? What do you feel still remains hidden? If you believe these sacred mysteries are worth exploring, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who seek truth beyond the surface. Because sometimes what we've called silence was God speaking all along.